Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my talk about Irvin Mcdowell, the forgotten leader of the largest army in American history at the Battle of First Bull Run. Just a brief background, as you may know, even though Irvin Mcdowell did lead the largest army in American history, there was no biography of him until last year, and this is it. And this came about because a friend of mine, Frank Simeone, and had a friend of his who was reenacting Mcdowell. And he asked a friend, well, sure, I'd like to read a little bit about Mcdowell. And the friend said, so would I, but there's no book. So Frank started the research about 5 years ago. And about 2 years ago, he asked me to join him through the help of a friend. And he knew that I had written several books about the Civil War, so we joined together. And we first self-published the book in 2021. And then I got into discussions with our friend Ted Savas, and Ted Savas agreed to publish the book, and it came out late 2023. So thank you, Ted. So let's get into the book. We have two very interesting quotes that I have here about Mcdowell. First one, I fear that I am one of the never have beens rather than one of those who have been and are. He said this after he heard that William Tecumseh Sherman gave a speech in Ohio in 1868 after the war and said the Ohio-born generals did more than anyone else to win the war, including himself, of course, and Ulysses Grant. There was one Ohio-born general that he did not name, Irvin Mcdowell. So Irvin Mcdowell was on his way to being forgotten already in 1868. Later, another excellent quote he said about First Bull Run, had I won that battle, I should have been the most popular man in America. I need not tell you how very much it is of the other at present. Okay. So Irvin Mcdowell was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1818. His father, Abram, was the mayor of Columbus for a while. He was a businessman, and this is their home in Columbus. And considering the size of most homes in America in that era, they were a fairly prosperous family, and which was also a very important factor. His mother was the cousin of Lewis Cass. Lewis Cass was an influential politician, Secretary of War, presidential candidate, and when he was Secretary of War, he nominated Irvin Mcdowell to go to West Point. Now, earlier, Cass had financed for the whole family to go to France for a few years. So Mcdowell studied as a teenager in the Collège de Troyes en France here, and then he joined and went to West Point. So he's extremely well educated and fluent in French, and it's good to have friends in high places. So he graduated 1838, and speaking of friends in high places, he was a staffer for Winfield Scott from 1838 to 1840, and again from 1848 until 1861. For 4 years, he taught artillery tactics at West Point, 1841 to 1845. During the Mexican War, he was on the staff of General John Wool, who was one of the leading generals under Scott during the Mexican War. And Mcdowell also was sent to Europe in 1858 for a year to study military techniques. All of these, serving under Scott, serving under John Wool, going to Europe, it's obvious that everybody considered that Irvin Mcdowell was an up-and-comer, and he was well positioned. On the other hand, he never engaged in actual fighting or led any troops. He was on the staff, truly, really being a bureaucrat. The other problem was he was rather aloof. He thought a great deal of himself. He was emotional. He didn't have very good impulse control. He was very impulsive, which was going to be one of his big problems. And he really didn't ever really understand the idea of being a commander. His instinct was always to be a staff member. So we're moving ahead. It's early 1861. Several states have seceded. Winfield Scott has moved his headquarters from New York to Washington. And the two sides have to decide who was going to be the leader of the first battles. And of course, both sides believed and both sides hoped that the battles would be very few, would be very quick, the war would be over quickly. So General Winfield Scott was the, of course, the commander, general in chief, but he was too infirm and he could not command the troops in the field. And he was a Virginian. He was very, very, very afraid, for good reason, that most of the fighting would be in Virginia. And he was hoping the war would not only be over fast, but also not devastate Virginia. For the Union, there were three main candidates. McDowell, of course, was one. He's 42 years old. He had been trained for this. George McClellan. George McClellan was considered very highly within the Army, very high reputation, but he had left, he had resigned, and he was a railroad executive in Cincinnati in 1861. And Joseph Mansfield. Mansfield was the commander of the Washington region. He was an engineer, but he was considered very, very old. He was 57. So those of us who have passed that age these days must understand that life expectancy about 48, 57 was pretty old. So those are the three main candidates. One of the most influential people in making this decision was, of course, Salmon Chase. Chase wanted an Ohioan. He thought Ohio should be the ones in charge. And his first thought was McClellan. But McClellan had become commander of Ohio's troops in mid-April. So Chase said, well, how about McDowell? McDowell was a good choice, and was a good friend of the family. One thing I should have mentioned here, that McDowell had married, while he was at West Point, he had married Helen Burden. Helen Burden was the daughter of Mr. Burden, who ran the ironworks, Burden Ironworks in New York, which made horseshoes. Helen Burden was very wealthy. Irvin McDowell became quite wealthy as a result of that marriage. So in 1861, here was the situation. Washington obviously was the headquarters where the forces were being gathered. PGT Beauregard had set up about 20,000 men on the line to protect the route to Richmond, but also the major railroad lines here. Joe Johnston was out in Winchester with about 12,000 men, and James Patterson was up around Charlestown with about 18,000. So those are the main four armies facing each other when the war was about to begin, or in mid-1861. Okay, well, the first step for the Union was to establish a foothold in Virginia. So in 1861, Union troops led by Mansfield crossed the Potomac River and established their control in Alexandria and Arlington, including at Arlington House. Arlington House was where Mrs. Lee lived there, and General Lee was he was there too, but Mrs. Lee owned the house. In May 1861, McDowell was chosen as the commander and a commander of the Department of Northeastern Virginia, May 27th, and he established his headquarters at Arlington House. Mrs. Lee had departed. And here's McDowell in the middle, and this is his staff at that time. So late May 27th, that McDowell becomes the commander. Mansfield was not very happy about this. McClellan really wasn't in the competition because he was heading up Ohio's troops. The Confederates were not very happy because they had lost Arlington and Alexandria, but they realized that, okay, that meant that the Union troops, having established their base just across the Potomac River, were going to be coming right where Beauregard was situated on the way to Richmond. Of course, the philosophy was you take the capital, you win the war. This is Joe Johnston here on the left. This is PGT Beauregard here on the right. McDowell has to organize an army. Again, he had always been a staffer. Now he's a commander. So he looked at his troops, all the volunteers coming in, many of them 90-day volunteers. And he said, well, I will probably need 4 to 5 months to get ready, to get these people. And even the 90-day volunteers, obviously, some of them will have left, more 90-day volunteers. So that was May 27th. So McDowell formulates a plan, puts his ideas in. Now, one thing that McDowell was a good planner. He did put together a good plan, go to the west, and then outflank Beauregard to his east on the way to through Fredericksburg on the way to Richmond. And by the time of in late June, he had 35,000 men, of whom probably a couple of hundred had ever seen combat. And he complained to this to Lincoln, and Lincoln said, well, your men are green, they're green too. So here's McDowell. This is his plan. Beauregard had about 22,000 men here, and he guarded all the fords of Bull Run. Bull Run was going to be one of the major barriers all the way where I'm going here. And he presumed that McDowell was going to come directly at him. He did not envision McDowell, who had been his West Point classmate, interestingly enough, a flanking. He was not really ready for a flanking maneuver in the beginning. When the plan was being implemented in late June, early July, the key for the Union was to make sure that this imbalance of troops, about 35,000, about 22,000, was kept that way, and that Joe Johnston stayed in around Winchester. And that, of course, that was the orders to Patterson. You keep Johnston busy. Do not let him come and reinforce Beauregard. And Patterson, who was a very good friend of Winfield Scott's, assured him, I will do that, not the slightest doubt. So on July 9th, 6 weeks later, Lincoln orders the advance. McDowell said, well, we're going to advance. We're not ready, but we're going to advance. Interestingly enough, the forces they begin their advance out of Arlington on July 16th, but Irvin McDowell was not with them. Irvin McDowell was spotted in the Washington train station that morning looking for supplies. A reporter came up to him and said, General, your army is marching west. Why are you here? Well, I don't have very good staff, and I've got to check these things out, make sure I get the right equipment. He had an impulse that he had to do it himself. Unfortunately, it was one of the things that he did very often. So as the army's advancing to the west, Irvin McDowell on July 16th is staying put. Eventually, he went to join them, but it took a while. Now, this is I put this slide up because it's interesting. As I half jokingly say, the idea was that there's only being one major battle. So everyone wants to be there. So everyone was there. And so it's kind of a panoply of major Civil War figures. We got Sherman, Jackson, Beauregard, Johnston, Burnside, Howard, Custer, Israel Richardson, Dixon Miles, James Longstreet, Edmund Kirby Smith, Jubal Early, Richard Ewell, and even Jefferson Davis, all on the battlefield. Everybody wanted to be there for the big battle, but Irvin McDowell was the commander. All right. So what happens? All right. So McDowell moves his forces out to Centerville around the circle here, and his forces are looking around there. He knows the Confederates have set up barriers all on Bull Run. I'm moving here. And McDowell arrives here. He knows the Confederates are there, and he says, you know, we have to go. I want to have a flank maneuver. I'm going to go and scout myself. And his staffer said, but General, you have, no, I'm going to do it myself. This is an instinct of a staffer. So he's going out to scout the left flank. He says, he tells General Daniel Tyler, who's in charge at that time. Now remember, you might make the Confederates think you're attacking, but don't attack. I'll be back eventually. So McDowell goes off. No one knows where he is. And guess what? Tyler attacks. He attacks at Blackburn's Ford. And this is the first, you can see here, Longstreet. This is the first action for Longstreet. And the Union forces are beaten back. McDowell comes back and says, you've disobeyed my orders. He admonished Tyler. They didn't work together very efficiently thereafter. McDowell realized that the flanking maneuver to the east was not going to work, so he's going to have to do a flanking maneuver to the west. Now you can look here, if you can see on the screen, all these forces along Bull Run, and this is the major highway, the Warrenton Turnpike. Beauregard thought if McDowell was going to attack, he's going to come right down the turnpike. So we have Nathan Evans here guarding it. But you'll notice that there was no Confederates on the northern part of Bull Run. So in that sense, almost by accident, McDowell's decided he's going to attack by the right flank worked because the Confederates weren't ready for that. So on July 19th and July 20th, McDowell starts looking for fords of Bull Run. He had no maps. So he decided, okay, well, we're going to go around all the way up here, all the way around to this ford, Sudley Ford. And we're going to make a flanking maneuver, flanking attack all the way around to attack the Confederates. And the Confederates, in fact, were not ready for that. Meanwhile, McDowell got a message that, in fact, Joe Johnston is on the way to the battlefield to reinforce Beauregard because Patterson had failed to keep Johnson in Winchester. Johnston arrived on the 20th with about 12,000 men. The very first use of railroad to transport the troops. It was very much of a Tunerville trolley kind of enterprise, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, but they did arrive in time. So on July 21st, the two armies were almost the same size. Beauregard, presuming that McDowell was going to attack down the Warrenton Turnpike, said, okay, well, I'll let him do that. And I'm then going to do his own flanking attack on the 21st. Both commanders were going to make attacks on the right flank of the other side. So on July 21st in the morning, the Union troops in blue here are moving over the fords and moving on the Confederate right flank. And the Confederates were not ready for them. They were over here. And Irvin McDowell, who was the overall commander should stay in the rear of the troops so he would know where they all are. Irvin McDowell rides to the front. He impulsively goes to the front of the troops. And so he's out here, out in the front, seeing what's going on. Simultaneously, Beauregard, not knowing that McDowell was going to attack here, is launching his attack. McDowell drives ahead. Here were those fords. And by noon, the Confederate forces were on the run. The Confederate forces were skedaddling. That's one of my favorite verbs from from the Civil War era. Meanwhile, Beauregard's flank attack floundered because the Union McDowell had left behind reserves, and Beauregard's orders went astray. So by around noon, Beauregard got a message that, by the way, the Union's flank attack is a great success, pushing us all back here. And Beauregard begins to gather defensive troops to meet the Union attack. Yeah, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, the Union is on the verge of victory. And this is one of the things that people don't remember about First Manassas, First Bull Run. It was almost a Union victory. And this fellow named Thomas Jackson, he's told to be ready to launch a counterattack. And Jefferson Davis, who had heard about the battle, had gotten on a train. He was on his way to the battlefield to see for himself. So Jackson and Davis were both getting ready to join the fun. Okay, at about 2:30, McDowell stopped his offensive for 2 hours. Nobody really knows why. His troops, again, these were all rookie troops. They were green. They were great success, but it's July. They're hot. They're tired. They hadn't eaten. So he sends back a message. We're on the verge of victory. And then when the Confederates were advancing against him down here, this is where the Henry Hill, the visitor center today at the National Park Service, McDowell, remember the overall commander, where does the overall commander stay? Behind his troops. McDowell rode up to look for himself to see what was going on. And what he saw was the Confederates ginning up for a very fast counteroffensive. So McDowell tried to stop them with artillery. He sent artillery here, but with a mix-up because of uniforms. And of course, there were thousands of uniforms. There weren't any uniforms here. The artillery was beaten back. The Union began to be overwhelmed on the counteroffensive. McDowell sent O. Howard, a regiment here in the east, to try to overcome, but it was too late because Joe Johnston was prepared. The Confederate counterattack. So Union troops, which had been on the verge of victory here, are now overwhelmed. And by 4 o'clock, there was a panicked retreat. And of course, the most direct route back was along the Warrenton Turnpike, but these guys had come here by the Studley Ford, and that's the way they went back. McDowell ordered a retreat. The Union forces were in a panicked retreat. Jefferson Davis consults with Johnston and Beauregard and said, now's the time to attack Washington. But Beauregard demurs, and so there is no attack on Washington. They weren't really ready for anything like that. Much of the day belonged to the Union. The end of the day belonged to the Confederacy. And McDowell is sent into limbo. Within hours, it's interesting reading the official records, within hours after getting information about the retreat, Winfield Scott orders McClellan from Ohio to come and replace McDowell. McDowell blamed the rushed planning and the poor quality of his troops, but he made some significant errors of judgment, and he was just too impulsive. So for the next 4 months, McDowell went into limbo. He had been the commander of the largest army in American history. Now he was just a supernumerary for a while. Okay, for the next several months, George McClellan, now the new commander, and here's McClellan and McDowell right in the middle of all the generals, began planning for his next adventure. And he planned, and he planned, and then he planned, and then he planned. So Lincoln became very impatient, but finally Lincoln approved the Peninsula Campaign for McClellan to go out to take Richmond. And McDowell would be one of the key commanders under McClellan, commanding the First Corps. But as it was on its way to Richmond, Lincoln and Stanton detach McDowell to Fredericksburg to guard Washington. And believe it or not, George McClellan thought this was McDowell dragging his feet, didn't want to help McClellan, that McDowell wanted to get command again. It was not true, but George McClellan tended to think the worst of his other generals sometimes. Okay, so for the next several months, McDowell became a puppet. He's in Fredericksburg. He's protecting against a Confederate attack against Washington in April and May. McClellan constantly asking for more troops. He wanted McDowell to come to Richmond, and McDowell wanted to go to Richmond, but he didn't. Instead, Lincoln orders McDowell to go to the Shenandoah Valley, where Stonewall Jackson had been riding rings around 3 other armies. So now there's a 4th army on its way to fight against Jackson, late May, early June. McDowell objected, but he obeyed. McClellan presumed that this was McDowell's idea and scheming against him. So that came to nothing. And in mid-1862, Jackson went to Richmond. The threat in the Shenandoah Valley was over. And Lincoln said, well, it's time for the hard hand of war. He decided to implement a harder policy, including taking their property, including slaves, and this is what the Emancipation Proclamation would be. So he brings John Pope, who had moderate success in the West, to create the Army of Virginia in Northern Virginia, envisioning very likely that eventually McClellan would come under Pope's command and that the Army of Virginia would be the main opponent from against Lee, because McClellan's Peninsula campaign was going nowhere. So Pope is ensconced here in Northern Virginia. Lincoln recalls McClellan from Richmond. McClellan begins to move his forces up the Potomac to come and assist Pope, and Irvin McDowell becomes commander of the First Corps, but also de facto John Pope's deputy and chief advisor. Okay, once Robert E. Lee knew that McClellan had left the peninsula, he began moving to the north, hoping to defeat Pope before McClellan could join that army. After one very short battle, late August, John Pope was based in Warrenton. Lee decided that the only way that he was going to defeat Pope was to get behind him. So he sent Jackson on the ride all the way around behind Pope to Bristow Station in Manassas. Pope's cavalry, Pope's scouts, Pope's intelligence knew nothing about it. And so on August 25th, August 26th, Jackson rode around and behind Pope. And Jackson was in Manassas on August 26th and August 27th. John Pope learned about this. He learned that Jackson was in Manassas, and he then ordered all of his forces to attack Jackson. He presumed that Jackson was going to stay in Manassas, and therefore Pope said, I'm going to bag Jackson until and defeat him before the other half of Lee's forces under Longstreet can get there. So Pope orders all of his forces to attack Jackson in Manassas on August 27th. Unfortunately, Jackson was not there. Jackson was here. Jackson had left Manassas, had taken his troops all the way around Centerville, back around, and had come to First Manassas battlefield. So Pope ordering his troops to attack forces which were not there. Meanwhile, McDowell and his forces coming up from Warrenton towards Gainesville. Gainesville is where I happen to live, as a matter of fact. He got a message from Pope. Take all your troops and attack Jackson over here in Manassas. Of course, Jackson wasn't there. Earlier that day, he had gotten a message from John Buford that Longstreet, the other half of Lee's forces, following Jackson's route through Thoroughfare Gap, was on the way. And August 27th, before they could move, McDowell's forces gets into a little bit of a skirmish with Jackson's troop. But McDowell said, well, Jackson's not there, so therefore this must be some wayward group of Confederates, nothing to be worried about. So McDowell has said to himself, okay, my orders are to go to Manassas, but Longstreet's coming. So he sends 3,000 men to Thoroughfare Gap up here to delay Longstreet. And he says to himself, John Pope doesn't really understand where the troops are. So I need to go. This is on the 28th. I need to go and tell General Pope what the situation is. So at 6 o'clock in the evening on August 28th, McDowell and two staff members ride off. Again, a job that should have been done by staff or senior generals. He himself rides off, and he leaves no orders for the troops that are left behind. So this is an impulse to go and find General Pope. And of course, he didn't know where General Pope was, and he didn't find him for 15 hours, as it turns out. So in his absence, the troops under Rufus King were attacked by Jackson. Remember, Jackson isn't supposed to be there. And this is the first part of the battle, Second Manassas. Rufus King, the deputy commander, is an epileptic. He has an attack. During this event, other generals, including Abner Doubleday, have to fill and hold off Jackson. Afterwards, King, having no other orders except to go to Manassas, orders his troops to leave this area and to go to Manassas to fight against Stonewall Jackson. Meanwhile, Longstreet had pushed off those forces that were supposed to stop him, and Longstreet marches through, and they take a position at Groveton where the Union troops had been. And he also begins to move his troops to the right flank of the Union troops. And John Pope refuses to believe that Longstreet is there. John Pope's philosophy was, I don't want him to be there, therefore he's not there. Meanwhile, George McClellan is acting with all due and deliberate speed to reinforce Pope. By this time, there were about 25,000 troops in Alexandria, ready, willing, and able to go to the front. And McDowell says, well, we either can defend Washington or let Pope get out of his scrape alone. Some would say this is too strong a statement, but I think McClellan wanted Pope to fail so that McClellan could regain command. That's a terrible thing to say, but there you are. And meanwhile, McClellan's chief deputy over here, Fitzjohn Porter, had been sending disparaging messages about Pope, which Ambrose Burnside had forwarded to the White House. So Lincoln was reading that one of McClellan's key advisors thought Pope was incompetent and was not going to give him his full support. Not the kind of morale you want in a force. Okay, so on August 29th, Pope finally figured out that Jackson's over here. So he orders all his forces to turn around and fight against Jackson. And he tells Fitzjohn Porter, his 5th Corps, on his way up, right down here with the arrow, you have to attack the right flank of Jackson, right here. And Pope refused to believe that Longstreet, you see where Longstreet's forces are, Pope refused to believe that there were any forces there. So all this is going on. McDowell, after 15 hours, finally comes back to his troops and he meets with Porter right about here. and they get the joint order from Pope, which says in effect, attack or retreat or stay put or use your own discretion. They're very confusing orders. And Porter, out here, having been ordered to attack, says, well, I can't because Longstreet's men are right in front of me. And of course, Pope believes Longstreet isn't there, so he thinks Porter is just dragging his feet deliberately. So nothing happens on the 29th. On the 30th in the afternoon, Porter finally moved up, finally attacked Jackson, but of course, Longstreet is fully engaged here on his flank, and the Union was in very great difficulty. Irvin Mcdowell at that point made his biggest mistake. He rode to John Reynolds, who knew that Longstreet was there. He told Reynolds, you have to come and help Porter in this attack. Reynolds knew that Longstreet was on the verge of attack. Reynolds obeyed orders. So Chin Ridge up here essentially became about 20,000 men from Longstreet attacking about 2,000 Union troops. When he finally saw what was happening, and here's the Confederate advance, a frantic Mcdowell tried to recall Reynolds, couldn't do it. He rode around the field, setting up a final defensive line at Henry Hill, which is exactly where First Bull Run had ended. Chin Ridge fell at 5 o'clock. Union defense was set up at 6. Irvin Mcdowell, this was his finest moment on a battlefield. He set up a very, very strong defensive line, which held off the Confederates into the night, and the retreat began to Washington at 7. Unlike at First Manassas, again, overwhelming majority of these troops are volunteers. They did not skedaddle. They held firm. This was by far the most important example that volunteer soldiers would and could fight. And Irvin Mcdowell got them ready. Of course, Irvin Mcdowell caused the problem in the first place, but that's another story. Okay, so the Confederates are held off. The Union retreats into the defensive lines. Robert E. Lee takes the flood tide and invades the North. The Maryland campaign begins. That's the next story. By November 1862, all 4 men responsible for the failure at Second Manassas been cast aside. John Pope was sent west to fight Indians. Fitz-John Porter was court-martialed. George McClellan was fired in November after his minimal success at Antietam, and Irvin Mcdowell would undergo a court of inquiry. None of these men would do any fighting on Civil War battlefields for the rest of the war. From mid-November 1862 until February 1863, there were 2 trials going on in Washington in the same building on different floors. Fitz-John Porter's court-martial, Irvin Mcdowell's inquiry. Each man fingered the other. Each man realized that if he were not guilty, then it was the other one. Mcdowell, and each man testified at the other man's inquiry. McDowell had significant selective amnesia about his several mistakes. He forgot a lot, and he obfuscated a lot. Did he lie? That's a judgment hard to make, but he certainly was not forthcoming to be helpful to Mr. Porter. The Porter's court-martial was, by any definition, a kangaroo court. I mean, Rufus King was one of the judges. Rufus King had been a commander at Second Manassas. Rufus King testified during the court-martial. Absolutely crazy. But Porter's insubordination made him guilty. He was convicted, cashiered from the Army. And Porter, in his final statement, said, no person was more responsible for my uh, being convicted than Irvin Mcdowell. And he essentially said McDowell had lied in every way possible. McDowell, in his court of inquiry, the court of inquiry was based upon a document that he wrote himself about what the issues were, and the court accepted that. So McDowell became the prosecutor and the defense in his own court of inquiry, and he had been accused of treason and drunkenness, but nothing happened. He was exonerated. However, I think he was very surprised that the court said that his abandoning the field, essentially disappearing for 15 hours on August 28th, was an extremely bad decision. And most importantly for Irvin McDowell's future, his mistakes, his misjudgments were aired. These were both public events in both trials. McDowell, after this, he knew his battlefield career was over, but he stayed in the Army. So from 1863 until 1882, he had a series of desk jobs, from dealing with frauds to deciding who should be retired. He commanded a few departments during Reconstruction, had a very limited influence. And after he commanded the districts of Kentucky and California, and essentially by seniority, eventually rose to the rank of Major General. From 1863, when Porter was convicted, until 1878, Porter and his friends were constantly searching for a new trial. They said that he had been convicted in the kangaroo court, which he had, and he wanted, but no one would have anything to do with him. Everyone presumed that he was guilty. Grant would not grant him a new trial, but under political pressure, finally, in October 1878, Rutherford B. Hayes, President Hayes, made a decision. He was going to create a special tribunal headed by John Schofield. Here's John Schofield here. And the tribunal would be to give Hayes advice should Porter's case be reheard again. So it's not a retrial, it's an inquiry to decide whether or not it should be tried again. Now, John Pope, who stayed in the Army, of course, and Irvin McDowell both had tried to deflect and deter Porter's efforts. They had to do everything they could to undercut him in Congress and in the Army. However, Porter had gathered considerable new evidence. He had a letter from Robert E. Lee about where the forces were and why it was a good idea for Porter not to attack when he was ordered to attack. And of course, Lee died in 1870, but he had those letters. And James Longstreet was invited to testify, as were other Confederates, to testify during this retrial. Pope and McDowell, again, continued to do everything they could because they knew if Porter was not guilty, then they were guilty. So the retrial, the hearing takes place. McDowell was called. There was over 70 pages of testimony. And he refused to add much to his testimony from the first trial. He said that the Battle of Second Manassas and all these hearings had been his personal nightmare for years. And whenever he was asked a question, he said he'd forgotten, and he obfuscated, he evaded answering at every opportunity. Interestingly, about halfway through his testimony, he said, "Oh, by the way, Porter said that he had sent me messages about why he wasn't advancing. And in preparation for this event in 1878, I looked through my papers and I found the messages that he sent. So this is 15 years later. And Porter's defense attorneys were, as a wonderful term from the Brits, they were gobsmacked. They said, "Now wait a you have these letters, you have proof about Porter." I said, "Well, they're not proof of that. What he said is wrong, but I have found the documents 15 years later." So how'd that happen, etc. Again, my co-author Frank Simeone and I said to each other, well, one of the reasons that there are very few records, very few letters, etc., from Irvin Mcdowell was because he obviously wasn't really good at keeping his records. I think this is an example. He finds these records 15 years after the fact. So, but it really didn't change anything. Mcdowell, again, obfuscated, evaded, prevaricated, you name it, everything he could, because again, if Porter's not guilty, then I'm guilty. So this tribunal, Schofield's tribunal, accepted entirely everything Porter said. They used Lee's letter, they used Longstreet's testimony. It said Porter acted valiantly, correctly. He did everything he could. He saved the Union Army from defeat on August 29th when he didn't attack. Well, and it said the insubordination in his letters, in his telegrams, well, that wasn't important. So the tribunal, by accepting everything Porter said, implicitly said that everything McDowell said was false. It didn't say that in that many words, but that's the implication. If Porter's true, McDowell is a liar. So this was sent back to Rutherford Hayes. Hayes sent it to Congress. Congress did not act on this until 1886, when Porter's conviction was overturned. Porter was formally reinstated in 1886 because there was a Democratic president and a Democratic-controlled Congress. So it was political to the end. But Irvin Mcdowell didn't know about this because Irvin Mcdowell died. This was the final crushing moment in Irvin Mcdowell's career. He was formally, implicitly called a liar. McDowell accepted the verdict. He stayed in command in San Francisco. He retired in 1882, and he became a parks commissioner, and with a reputation for beautifying the city. He died in 1885, and he is buried in the cemetery at the Presidio. This is his tombstone. And this is really the odd thing. For unknown reason, his name is misspelled. He's misspelled as Irwin, not Irvin. Now, there's a story there. I don't know what it is, because his wife lived for 6 more years, and obviously his wife was there, but she moved back to New York, and she's buried in New York, not here. So we don't know the reasons, but Irwin McDowell has a tombstone in San Francisco, not Irvin. Our conclusion is that Irvin McDowell was a dutiful, diligent, dependable military man who belonged behind a desk, not on a battlefield. When I give my talks, I talk about a couple of men, Montgomery Meigs and George Marshall. And I say, there's George Marshall, 5-star general. How many battles did he fight in World War II? Answer, 0. 5-star general, because he had value. Montgomery Meigs, how many battles did he fight in? 0. The greatest unsung hero of the Civil War for the Union. So Irvin McDowell should not have been on the battle. He was impulsive. He acted like a staffer. He didn't think through his actions. And he wasn't really very good at trials either, because he tended to try to obfuscate so much. But anyway, so we thought, even though there aren't many sources, we wrote this book because Irvin McDowell was an important person. And so with thanks to Ted Savas for having the confidence in us to produce this book. This book is available via the Savas Beatty website, and that's a lot to look at. Savas Beatty searching for Irvin Mcdowell, the Civil War's Forgotten General, but I think you just do on Savas Beatty, you can find it. So thank you very much, and I hope we have some questions.